All right, we're back and let's get started with menopause. So, menopause, the word menopause literally means meno means month and pause means pause. So, it means you stop having your monthly cycles. Typically, women will go through a period called the climacteric, which is a 2 to 5 year period where hormones start to change. And this can start as early as the mid 30s. This is why fertility starts to be a problem in women over the age of 35, because women may be entering the climacteric and not really even know it yet. Things are happening inside their bodies that aren't having necessarily an impact on their menstrual cycles, or maybe they always had irregular menstrual cycles anyway, so they really didn't notice it. It's about a 2 to 5 year period where the hormones start to change, and that's a function of that HPG axis that we've talked about before, right? The hypothalamus, pituitary gland, gonads, in this case ovaries axis. And so the feedback loop starts to be altered so that the hypothalamus is sending out all that, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the pituitary gland is responding by sending out about a bunch of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And then the ovaries are not responding the way that they normally would. They aren't necessarily ripening an egg, or they are ripening an egg, but the follicle now has become kind of rubbery so that the egg takes a really long time to ultimately burst out of it. Things like that, like things will start to change. Now, we think the hypothalamus is the ringleader that is kind of starting the process of hormonal alteration, but the hypothalamus is governed in part by genes. So the hypothalamus is starting to shut down its production of gonadotropin releasing hormone, is partly governed by genes. A really good way for a woman to predict when she's likely to go into menopause is to look at her mom, or her mom's mom, or her dad's mom, and see, like, how old were they. That would be really easy if women in grandma's age bracket would be willing to talk about stuff like this. A lot of women historically have not really wanted to talk about, change of life, as they call it, and that it's embarrassing or too private. And so oftentimes it's difficult for women to get a good pattern of, well, what happened to my mom? What happened to my grandmothers? What did my genes hold for me, right? Now, it's not a guarantee that what happened for mom or grandma is what's going to happen for an individual, but that's a really good predictor because there is a genetic component to this. It's also partially influenced by the environment. Women who are in more stressful environments may enter menopause earlier. They may have also started their periods earlier. A really good predictor of when menopause is likely to happen is basically 40 years after the onset of puberty, the first menses. So if you know how old you were when you had your first menses or menarche, add 40 years to that, and that's approximately a good predictor of when the climacteric is probably going to begin. So some symptoms that women go through when they're going through the menopausal transition, or climacteric that I called it. So the green is during the transition. And so what we are seeing is these bars that represent the range of percent of women who complain of this issue. So at the top, we've got mood symptoms, and we see somewhere between 20 and 50% of women reporting mood symptoms. Urinary complaints, a lot of times this has to do with urinary incontinence, where suddenly when you sneeze, you pee a little, or when you jump, something like that. Sleep disturbance is reported by about 45% of women. Vaginal dryness is somewhere between 10 and 40%. Vasomotor symptoms, these have to do with sort of heart-related things, and that's about somewhere between 38 and 65% of women will report that they're having sort of like elevated heart rates or flutters or other kinds of things. So you're seeing, if you compare those green bars to the, what color do you call that grayish one that's below it? Those are the women who are premenopausal. They haven't started to have any of these symptoms yet. And so you can see that the mood symptoms are not that different between the women who are going through menopause and the women who haven't started it yet. Little bit more common among the ones who are going through menopause. Urinary complaints, teeny tiny bit more common among those who are going through it, but not really. Right now, sleep disturbance, I'd argue there's a wider variation in the premenopausal women, narrower variation in the women who are going through menopause, but it looks like the women who are going through menopause are having more sleep disturbance than the women who aren't. Vaginal dryness, again, it overlaps a lot of what's going on with the women who are premenopausal, but there's a big bar extending past it. So for a lot of women, they're going through menopause, they will complain of vaginal dryness way more than they would have when they were not going through menopause. And then vasomotor symptoms, again, it's more common in women who are going through menopause. So those are some interesting little symptoms that women complain about. You'll notice that there's nothing here really about irritability or something like that. What they've found when they look around the world, so you take out the effect of culture and you just sort of look at what might be biologically based by looking around the world and seeing, what do all women complain about, not just what do American women complain about. You look around the world, and irritability is not necessarily something that other parts of the world complain about. So it seems like there might be some like cultural expectations about what it means to be going through menopause. And then oftentimes we then view a person through the lens of what we expect them to be displaying because of what they're going through. So you'll notice that's not even on the list. Now, menopause is considered complete when a woman has gone an entire year without ovulation. And a lot of times they don't know whether they've ovulated or not, so the simpler thing is to say menstruation. So here we have a graph that shows how estrogen levels, which is what's represented on the y-axis, decrease like off a cliff so that you go from a person who has a bunch of estrogen at the beginning of perimenopause or the climacteric. They go through the period of menopause where they're having all these changes that we just discussed, and then they exit the other side postmenopausally, and their levels of estrogen are really, really low, and will stay like that. So menopause is a clear change of life that is biologically driven, very analogous to what happens at puberty, right? Like if puberty turned all this on, menopause turns it all off. The average age of menopause is 51, but some women are significantly younger than that, and some are significantly older than that when they go through menopause. It's just like puberty in that way. Now let's compare this to what men go through, what we have started to call andropause. Andro is referring to the androgens, that's the group of hormones that contains testosterone. So, do men go through something similar that we could call male menopause? We do see that men start to show changes in their hormone levels around age 55, but of course, again, it varies. You'll see decreases in testosterone. Now, I pulled this off of the internet. Look at this. This is an ad for over-the-counter kind of, you order it off the internet, no prescription needed kind of treatment for, low testosterone. First off, very professional. But look at this list of symptoms: tiredness, decrease in strength and muscle power, depression, anger, and confusion. I do appreciate that they spelled lack of confidence incorrectly. Indecisiveness, feeling of lost, decrease in sex drive, weight gain, thinning of bone. First off, I pulled it because, come on, who buys this stuff when this is the ad? But they're implying that a lot of symptoms that might have to do with maybe depression, or symptoms that might have to do with being under stress at work, or a bunch of other factors are all attributable to drops in testosterone. Like it's a known thing and that we need to treat it. What we actually see in men when you test their testosterone levels across adulthood, so we start over here at 25 on the far left. This actually goes all the way to 100, but we're going to stop at 65 for the purposes of our conversation. Does this look at all like the cliff that I showed you that estrogen goes over in women? It doesn't look anything like that. This is a gentle rolling hill. Yeah, there are decreases in testosterone levels, but in order to fuel Fertility and sexual desire, you only need a tiny little scant amount of testosterone. In order to maintain muscle mass and other just normal male functioning, you just need the equivalent would be a teaspoon of sugar in an Olympic sized swimming pool is how much testosterone needs to be in the body. Just a teeny tiny nanomilliliter of testosterone is enough to fuel healthy functioning. So yeah, it's highest in young adulthood, and then it does decrease across the rest of regular adulthood. It drops off most pronouncedly from 75 to 100. But it's a very gentle decrease, just like the decreases in strength that we talked about, or just like the decreases in sensation and stuff like that we talked about. It's nothing like female menopause, that's for sure. Now, something that males and females can experience is osteoporosis. A lot of times people talk about it like it's just something that affects women, and it is something that is more common in women, but it can affect both sexes. Factors that can increase the likelihood of osteoporosis, and that's you're seeing on the right-hand side a bone that has a lot of air pockets in it compared to the normal bone on the left. Osteoporosis makes your bones more brittle and more likely to break. Things that can contribute to osteoporosis, believe it or not, research has shown that consumption of the brown carbonated types of sodas, I won't name any brands, but it needs to be brown and carbonated and contain caffeine. The caffeine and the potassium in those drinks interact with your thyroid gland to cause an imbalance where you start to absorb calcium and not deposit it into your bones. So having a chronic period of especially during like adolescence and young adulthood of consuming carbonated, caffeinated, cola beverages has been associated with higher risks of bone fractures, even in young adulthood, development of osteoporosis, even in younger adulthood. It's much more common for osteoporosis to develop in later adulthood. There are factors that make us higher at risk, such as genes, body style. A person with a lighter frame, lighter boned, are more likely to develop osteoporosis. People of European descent are more likely to develop osteoporosis. So there are a number of risk factors. And in fact, I'll go ahead and put a video into the playlist that'll have somebody explaining the risk factors so that you can see that. I think that'll... Oh, this is on WebMD, unfortunately. So I can't put it into the playlist. But, there are a number of factors that some of which you can't really avoid. I mean, your genes are what your genes are. But there are things that you can do to help keep your bones as strong as you can. And one of them is like walk. Weight-bearing exercises are really helpful in keeping the bones dense. Lifting things with your arms to keep your arm bones dense. Those kinds of things can really help. And, avoiding the kinds of foods that will deplete calcium levels in the diet. Adding calcium is not always the solution because that can cause bone spurs in your jaw especially, and that is the craziest thing in the world to have a bone spur in your jaw. So you don't want to necessarily just add calcium to your diet. You want to make sure that you're trying to, as much as you can, maintain your healthy bones. All right, so I think this is a good time to take a break because we'll come back and we'll talk about, what are some health habits that we can engage in to really keep ourselves healthy throughout adulthood. So I'll see you in the next segment.